This is a video about David Ricardo. Ricardo is one of the more influential classical economists in terms of the more modern literature that we'll study. We'll see Ricardo's theory of comparative and absolute advantage, which you likely saw in a Principles 202 class or Intermediate 306 class. We'll talk about his theory of value, which is sort of an adaptation on what we saw in Adam Smith. We'll spend some time with Ricardo's Korn model, which is his model of rent, wages, and profit, which kind of similar themes to what we've seen in the past authors. And we can also talk about economic growth in terms of the Korn model, the role of different groups of people, different classes of people in our society. Finally, we'll talk about Ricardo in relation to Malthus. They had a couple of debates. One is the Booleanist debate, whether paper currency or fiat currency should be backed by a gold standard. And there was also the machinery debates about whether technological improvements, machinery improvements were good or bad for workers. So the comparative advantage in trade stuff, again, you're likely familiar with. I'll just kind of go through it pretty quickly in this video. A country has an absolute advantage if it can produce more outright than the other country. So we can see here, A can produce more rice outright, more cars outright. A has the absolute advantage in the production of both goods. But we can translate this into what each worker is giving up to make rice or cars, and we can find that the opportunity costs differ in country A and country B. The theory here of comparative advantage is that each country should specialize in the good which they give up less to produce and then trade. If I do that, then you've probably seen in different class, we can have more overall production. Standards of living can rise in each country. Right, so here, country A gives up one car each time they produce a rice. Country B is giving up 3 cars every time they produce one rice, or 1.5 cars for each half rice. So clearly they're giving up more cars in country B when they produce rice. A has the lower opportunity cost of producing rice. A produces rice, B cars, they trade. We could get to a higher level of production than each could in autonomy, producing some combination of rice and cars. Autonomy meaning here by themselves without trade. All right, so jumping into the theory of value then, which is very comparable to Smith. Remember in Smith, the inputs of production, which we know as labor and capital, were classified as direct labor, L, and indirect labor, K. And Smith said you could just add up the total hours and that would be a good comparison of value. Ricardo reclassifies indirect labor as kind of more of the K that we know and talk about today, which can be either fixed or circulating. Fixed capital might be land or large machines on the land. Circulating could be human capital like know-how, or you might have kind of smaller machines that could move from plot to plot. Right, so Ricardo thinks that if all producers used the capital of the same quality and equal amounts of labor, all products would have the same value. So the difference in value comes from the quality of capital. Otherwise, we would just have the same amount of labor, same technology, and so on, essentially produce the same product. So we need this group of people, which Ricardo calls capitalists, who create value. Value is profit or interest from the use of machines to work land or use natural capital, and they need to be compensated. So capitalists need to be compensated for the risk of inventing or producing these new machines in order to create growth. All right, so again, we have these different kinds of capital now, or different qualities of capital, rather than in Adam Smith them all being the same. And who produces capital of different kinds and qualities? It's this group of people called capitalists, right? So you might think of these instead as, say, machinists or inventors, rather than capitalists in sort of the more modern sense. Right, we'll see in the Korn model that ultimately it's kind of a more modern idea to incorporate this concept of rent just into profit. Beyond Ricardo, it seems that for the most part, we would talk about rent as being a part of profit. So let's have a look at the corn model. This comes out of the UK's corn laws, which were intended to stabilize domestic grain prices. So if there was a good harvest in one year, they would have high import tariffs and low export duties. So they want people to be able to sell the large amount of grain in the country. If there was a bad harvest, they'd have low import tariffs so they could bring in grain to feed people, but high export duties because they wanted to keep that grain in the country. Right. Malthus and later Ricardo say that they need to repeal the corn laws to expand trade. And we'll kind of see in the next figure, our corn model graph, what is the role of international trade, or why this is a solution to the Malthusian problem, where ultimately you get to some plot of land where the productivity is the same as wages, and there's no more profit or rent on that plot of land. So there's no incentive to produce more past that point. Right. So this results in stagnation, which Adam Smith and some of the early economists fear. So how do we avoid that? Again, comparative advantage, international trade. So let's take a look. Just our assumptions going into this. We're going to see rent as a difference in land quality. So that's coming almost directly out of Malthus. Ricardo has kind of a novel conception of wages. In all of the past models, we've seen our wages as just being subsistence wage. And Ricardo does say that in the long run, wages of the working class will tend to subsistence. But at any given time, the market wage could differ from the natural or subsistence wage. If it's higher, then Ricardo from Malthus thinks that population will grow and will bring more land into use. And if the market wage happened to be lower than subsistence, then people start dying and population decreases and so on. All right, finally, we've got now profit as a difference between this rent and wages. So what's going on here on the graph? We've got a continuum of land quality, which is decreasing. So our first lands are the most productive. Here we're now measuring it in income rather than productivity of land. But we've got this total product off of our land, which we measure as the average productivity of each laborer, APL. So what this is saying is because we can order our land from most to least productive, the average product of labor must be decreasing, because once we get to the less productive lands, each laborer is going to harvest less crops or produce less on those lands. Right. We also see finally, for the first time, kind of this marginal thinking. We know that the marginal product of labor, or the product of labor off of the next unit of land, must be below the average product of labor, because average product or total product is decreasing. Right. If we bring one more unit of land into use, it's going to be less productive than the average. So the marginal, or the next, is below the average. All right, so now we can define these rent, profit, and wages. So suppose that we are right here using this quantity of land, Q1. And also suppose for now that our market wage happens to be higher than the subsistence or long run wage. Right, so here at Q1, we have this difference between the productivity of this land and the productivity of the next land. So the difference between average and marginal, or this differential of land quality, is going to be rent at this point. And we can see there were these rents at any intermediate quantity up to here. So here is the difference, here's the difference, and so on. At Q1, this right here is the difference. So here's our amount of rent. We have wages, and at this point, wages happen to be higher than subsistence. So we're paying this amount of wages here, and then the difference is profit. So again, we don't have a formally or mathematically defined profit function or anything. We're just defining it, again, kind of as a difference. So what's going to happen here if the wage happens to be in the short run a little bit higher than subsistence? From Malthus, what are people going to do? Have more kids. When we have more kids, we have more people, more total production given specialization and division of labor. So we call more land into use, and this goes on until at some point we reach this maximum quantity. And why is this the maximum quantity? Well, here the marginal product of labor is equal to subsistence. And so profit at this particular point right here falls to zero. And there would be no incentive to bring more land into use because they're going to make a negative profit off of any additional land. Right, so here's our maximum quantity. At this point, we're done growing, the economy stagnates, all profit is kind of crushed out of the market into rent, and so there's no incentive to innovate or bring more land into use. So then, referring back to these classes of people, the landowner, they're making these rents. Ultimately, as we get towards this stagnation point, it becomes more and more valuable to have the good quality land compared to having the bad quality land. We know what the workers do, they earn subsistence. And so the question is, what is the role of the capitalist in this model? The capitalist could be earning some of this profit. Some of this profit could also be going to the landowner. There's no specific distribution, but capitalist is making these new machines. We want to avoid getting to this Qmax point. So the role of the capitalist in this model would be to either innovate or to engage in international trade. And either one of those would increase these average product, marginal product curves. So that takes us, it takes us longer to get to this maximum quantity. Right? So as long as we're expanding MPL and APL via innovation and trade, we can avoid economic stagnation. Still, in that model, while wages might vary around subsistence, in the long run, they will go to subsistence. So workers aren't necessarily better off here, but there might be some economic benefits to avoiding that stagnation point where we're done growing. All right, so finally, we talk about a couple of debates between Ricardo and Malthus, who were close friends but disagreed on many things. First of all, the Booleanist controversy: should fiat currency be backed by gold? This was sort of triggered by a run on the UK banks caused by a conflict with France. There's a run on UK banks, and as a result, the UK removed the gold backing from its currency. The US would follow suit, but much later. So the debate is, should there be a gold standard for our paper fiat currency? Smith and some of the folks before him say no, there should not be a gold standard. The division of labor increases productivity and reduces the input prices and final good prices. And so we don't get inflation, even though banks might be lending more and creating money. Ricardo, on the other hand, argues that without the gold standard, banks tend to overlend, creating inflation. So Adam Smith, in some way, is kind of a perfect information person, thinks that the invisible hand of the market will kind of regulate itself so that we have this reduction in input and final good prices that matches, that will offset the price increases from lending and new money creation. Ricardo says, yeah, it doesn't probably work that smoothly. We're going to have some frictions. Banks are going to lend too much and it's going to create inflation. We need this gold standard in order to set a cap or limit the amount of inflation in the economy. Right, later, the gold standard was removed in the United States, and the reasoning for that was essentially the creation of the Federal Reserve and the policy tools that came with it to regulate inflation. And that sort of theory we'll start seeing in the Keynesian stuff.